This is Grid Force, Mask of the Goddess. This is an action RPG going with the whole Mega Man Battle Network style battle system, but just to go ahead and nip the comparisons down right now, this is not like One Step from Eden. This is not a deck builder or a roguelite or anything like that. It's not card-based. This is instead more of a semi-linear, actual story-based RPG with a lot of different characters to recruit. And a very interestingly implemented branching narrative that has a lot of different scenes for you to see and things that show that there's been a lot of love put into the narrative of this game, but more on that a little bit later. First of all, how does it actually play? It does use that grid-based real-time battle system that was made popular, of course, by the Mega Man Battle Network games, although in this case it uses it quite a bit differently because, for one, the grids are almost never symmetrical. Usually your side and the enemy side look a little bit different. They have different numbers of squares on each side, and also sometimes there are other hazards and things in the way. There could be like lava on the ground in some spots that hurt you when you stand on it, or big stones that block the way but also allow you to sort of line of sight enemy projectiles and things like that. And this is also a game that's going for more of a bullet hell kind of thing, and in fact the Steam store page actually even says that. And that is very clearly implemented in all of the aspects of the combat. And it is a very fast-paced game, but it's not as fast as something like One Step from Eden, in my opinion. It's actually about as fast as the later Battle Network games, like the sixth ones. So it still is very speedy, and of course it definitely involves you moving around all the time, since as a bullet hell influenced game there are tons of projectiles on the screen at any given time, and it is of course your job not to get killed by them. So you have 4 different characters with which to do that. Well, you have a lot of characters actually, but you can choose 4 characters at any time to have in your squad, and you can switch between them in real time whenever you want in combat, and every character has a good list of different things they can do. They have a basic spammable attack as well as a strong attack that usually has some sort of special properties to it. They will also unlock 2 different active abilities that they can use after you level them up enough, and they will also have some different passives and upgrades to those abilities that they can get as you continue to improve them. Every character has this little orange gauge below their portrait there that is your force gauge, and that's sort of like MP kind of. It's used by all of your attacks, including your basic attack, in different amounts. Obviously your strong attack and your various active abilities will use it much faster, but once this empties out, you basically can barely attack at all. You can only attack very slowly and you become very ineffective. But if you switch that character out, their force gauge regenerates quite quickly, so you're encouraged to constantly swap characters out when they run out of force. Also, the characters do heal when they're not active as well. Their health does regenerate much slower than the force gauge, but they do still heal, which is useful. In addition to all of this, each character has 1 mask slot. Every time you beat one of the big story-important goddess boss battles, you'll get a mask that is themed towards that goddess, and you can equip any of these on any character that you want, and these give a percentage increase to different stats, as well as a smaller percentage decrease to other stats, so they do have a downside, as well as giving you 1 very powerful active ability to cast on the Y button, and this gets a separate purple gauge, which basically makes it like a limit break, effectively. This will build up through multiple screens of battle as you actually deal damage and parry projectiles and stuff, and once it's full you can cast this big ability. Now you do have a block button that reduces the damage you take, but more importantly, if you hit the block button just at the right time when a projectile is just about to hit you, you'll parry it and actually deflect it back to where it came from. And this is required. This is arguably the most important mechanic in the combat. You'll be deflecting all the time. If you're not deflecting, you're dying, basically, because it's a bullet hell influenced game, so there's tons of projectiles on the screen at all times, so you need to learn the timings to deflect these projectiles back to where they came from. Also, enemies will have a little purple gauge that builds up in the opposite direction of their health gauge draining, and if it ever exceeds their health gauge, they'll go into a stagger mode where they're completely stunned and can't act for a few seconds, and they'll take massively increased damage during this time. Different attacks will build up this stagger gauge, but the best way to build it up is to deflect their projectiles back at them. That builds it up more than anything else, and this is often a required thing to do in boss battles, because bosses have quite a lot of health and defense. However, if you're able to stagger them, they take way more damage whenever they're staggered, so you really need to be doing this as often as possible. You can get past, I would say, the first world without really mastering the deflection system, but after that it becomes pretty much necessary to actually know how to do it really effectively, because the number and strength of projectiles increases drastically after that point. Battles take place on a screen-by-screen basis. Each world takes place on a number of different screens and different paths, and each screen has at least 1 wave of enemies, sometimes multiple waves of enemies, or even mini-boss fights, other characters to recruit. Sometimes you actually have to fight these characters first, and of course the big important story boss fights. Every time you kill enemies, as well as complete each individual screen, you will get a bunch of these sigils. This game uses a relatively complex 6-element system. It's sort of like a rock, paper, scissors idea where each element is strong against one and weak against another. There's earth, light, dark, water, fire, and air, and each one has its own color of sigil that enemies will drop. And you use these to actually improve your characters. Every time you complete a screen before you move on, you have the ability to actually manage your squad, and this is where you level up characters. Every stat has its own element tied to it. For instance, your health, your HP gauge is tied to Earth, so you need Earth sigils to level that one up, and so on. And if you have enough sigils, you can actually pour them into each of these stats to increase them. And every character has a different maximum amount that each stat can be increased to. So basically every character has their own growth stats. And also, every time you successfully level up one of these stats, the character will get this little diamond symbol next to a vertical gauge on the left side of the level up screen. And once you get 6 of these symbols, the character will gain a star. And this is how you get all of the increased skills and things from leveling up characters. Whenever you get 6 of these little pips, you'll gain a star. And after you gain a certain number of stars, the characters will get new capabilities, like new active skills, upgrades to skills they already have, or new passives and things like that. So higher star characters have more of their stuff unlocked. As you star them up, they get more of their kit. Every character also, of course, has an element that all of their attacks deal that sort of damage, and you're encouraged to get your squad of 4 to be good against the weaknesses of whatever kinds of enemies you're facing in the world you're currently in. And there are something like 30 characters-ish around there, so there's a lot of characters to find and develop, which is really cool, each of them with their own attacks and specials and extra skills and all that stuff. So there's definitely a lot of character development to do in this game. Now, the story is actually really well written, in my opinion, because it's sort of an interesting idea of you're trapped in a cycle, one of those kinds of stories, and you're trying to figure out how to break the cycle, or at least how to figure out what's going on, because your character has forgotten all of the previous cycles, but all of your other characters around you have not. And they can't really tell you much about it because that would sort of risk breaking everything. So you have to make various choices along the way, not really knowing exactly what's happening, in order to try and find out what's happening and see if you can actually solve this problem, because in all of the previous cycles you've failed and died, which is why it keeps starting over and over again. So you've got to figure out how to actually do it right. And the story is told in a mixture of a couple of different ways. For one, it's told in a more standard, just dialogue screens with characters talking to each other on the battlefield and things, but it's also told in these really well-drawn manga-like panels. These mostly show up between worlds and for the very big story moments, and they're really nice. Like I said, they're very well drawn and they have a lot of character to them. Everyone displays a good amount of emotion in their body language and their faces and things. They're drawn with a lot of artistic talent, that's for sure, and they look really nice. And one of the big focuses of this game, talking about the story, are the choices that you make, and this part I really, really like. Basically, this game is really good at giving you choices that actually feel like they matter. Most of the choices aren't just go left or go right, or obvious good or evil choices. They're instead more complicated than that. They're more like pragmatism versus self-sacrifice, kind of, and the choices actually have some really long-reaching effects as later parts of the story develop. You could choose, for instance, to chase after a character that you found earlier, and it will lead to a bunch of difficult battles, but will also lead to them trusting you more by the end of that world and actually giving you the ability to recruit them after you beat the boss. At one point, you have the choice between actually fighting a very difficult boss as the final boss of that area in order to advance the plot, or killing one of the characters you could possibly recruit and not having to fight the boss. So you can basically choose to fight the difficult boss and recruit both characters, or recruit one of the characters, kill the other, and then leave without having to fight the boss. And that's a really neat choice because it actually gives you more of a good reason to think about what you think this character should actually do. And later on, you actually get an even more difficult choice where a very important character is dying, and you have a choice between sacrificing the sort of narrator lady who's been helping you out and telling you what to do this whole time, or sacrificing one of the masks that you've gotten from beating one of the goddesses. And you'll only have a couple of them at this point, and of course if you do sacrifice it, it is gone for the rest of the playthrough. You won't be able to use it at all. So the choices are actually presented in kind of an interesting way that makes them less of like an obvious good or evil, and more that you're just trying to do what you think is best to try and figure out what's actually going on, and how you go about that is up to you. But not only are the choices actually quite good in this game, they also have a lot of differentiated dialogue between the choices you could make. So for instance, I chose to sacrifice a mask for that particular choice, and this is actually mentioned later on. During the intro discussion of the next world, they actually mention my choice and we talk about it, which is really cool because it shows that there obviously would have been a completely different conversation between your characters had you chosen something else there. Another really cool thing in this vein that this game does is that once you complete an area, you can go back to it at any time you want to, just to farm for resources or whatever, but you don't reverse time when you do that. When you go back to the area, it's actually that area after you have already completed it, which means things change. New enemies are there that are often much harder. Sometimes the characters that you left behind are there doing something else that they weren't doing before. So returning to previous areas isn't just like reversing time and going there as if it was your first time every time. It's actually more like you're going there again after what you did just happened. So now there are new characters and things that are doing something else, and you can actually recruit those characters if you go back, but you'll have to do different things than you originally would have had to do to recruit them the first time around if you chose to recruit someone else, because now the story has advanced and their individual plots have advanced as well. This is pretty cool because it's something that I feel not enough RPGs actually do, which is you can go back to an area you were in previously and have it be changed because of what you did the first time you were there. So I really respect the dedication, and in fact there's often even entirely new conversations between the characters that you do have when you do return to these areas, so there's a lot of new content even if you just go back. So it's clear that these areas have a lot of love poured into them, and that the conversations and characters have a lot of thought put into them because of all these changes actually being like canonically linear, so that when you do return or when you choose certain choices and things, the characters will actually respond to this, and there seems to be a lot of different permutations of conversations that can happen depending on your choices up to that point. So overall, I would definitely recommend Grid Force because it's just, first of all, a really fun action RPG using this Battle Network combat system in a way that I've never quite seen it used before. It's got a lot of characters to recruit, so there's a lot of gameplay variety, which is always good for this sort of thing. And also the story is genuinely interesting, and the choices are actually sometimes kind of hard to make, and the fact that there are so many different new conversations and different consequences to be had because of the choices you make really make them feel more important and more weighty than they otherwise would. So the link will be in the description below this video to the Steam store page if you wish to check the game out yourself. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.